Chapter 18, Episode 18, Familiar Fate. The hidden garden pulsed with magical energy as Sabrina and her team rushed through its shifting pathways. Spring flowers and autumn leaves swirled together in impossible patterns, their colors bleeding into each other as the magical storm grew overhead. "Here," Sabrina directed, pointing to a natural clearing where several ley lines converged. "We need to establish the ritual circle quickly." Her students moved with practiced efficiency, placing crystals, herbs, and magical artifacts in precise positions. Each component had been carefully chosen to represent different aspects of Hallowville's magical heritage. Ancient Halloween talismans sat alongside fresh spring blooms, their energies beginning to harmonize under Sabrina's guidance. Noah paced the perimeter, directing teams to strategic positions around the ritual site. "Taylor, take the north point. Maria, watch the eastern approach. We can't let anything disrupt the ritual once it begins." The artifact hummed in Sabrina's hands as she knelt at the center of the circle. Its power responded to the garden's magical nexus, sending out pulses of energy that made the air shimmer. She began the delicate process of attunement, whispering incantations that would link the artifact to the garden's ancient magic. Around her, students joined hands and began weaving protective spells. Their individual magical signatures blended together, creating a dome of shifting energy above the ritual site. Different magical specialties complemented each other. Protection charms intertwined with weather magic, healing energy merged with defensive barriers. Quill took its place beside Sabrina, the hedgehog familiar's evolved form radiating with unprecedented power. Its quills glowed with an inner light that shifted between spring and Halloween magic, perfectly embodying the balance they sought to restore. The familiar's presence helped stabilize the wild energies swirling around them. As Sabrina spoke the first words of the ritual proper, the magical storm above responded violently. Lightning in impossible colors forked across the sky, and the wind carried echoes of both spring bird songs and Halloween whispers. The very air seemed to resist their efforts, growing thick and heavy with conflicting magical currents. She felt the full weight of Hallowville's magical heritage flowing through the artifact. Centuries of carefully maintained balance, generations of rituals and celebrations, all connected through this single point in time. The responsibility was enormous, but Sabrina's voice remained steady as she continued the incantation. The first wave of magical backlash hit their protective barrier like a physical force. Students staggered but held their positions, their combined magic flexing but not breaking under the assault. Noah's voice rang out over the magical turbulence, directing reinforcements to weakening points in their defense. "The eastern barrier's starting to crack," Maria called out, her hands raised to channel more power into the protective dome. "Divert power from the western point," Noah commanded. "We need to." His voice cut off as they all felt it, a massive surge of opposing magic approaching fast. The very ground beneath them trembled with its power, and the artifact in Sabrina's hands pulsed urgently in response. "They're coming," Sabrina announced, her eyes fixed on the approaching magical signature. "Everyone hold your positions. Whatever happens, the ritual cannot be interrupted." The opposing magic drew closer, its presence distorting the reality around it. Spring magic, twisted and amplified beyond its natural limits, threatened to overwhelm the garden's careful balance. The air grew thick with the scent of accelerated growth and decay as the two magical forces prepared to clash. Quill's quills stood on end, detecting the imminent collision of magical forces. The familiar moved closer to Sabrina, its evolved abilities creating a small bubble of stability around the ritual circle. The artifact's power flowed through both of them now, connecting them to the very heart of Hallowville's magic. The spring faction burst into the garden like a tidal wave of magical energy. Their leader, a tall woman with flowers blooming in her silver hair, directed her followers with precise gestures. Vines erupted from the ground, reaching for the ritual circle with unnatural speed. "Protect the circle." Noah's voice cut through the chaos. He moved with practiced efficiency, organizing their defenders into strategic formations. His years of tactical experience showed as he anticipated and countered the spring faction's movements. The air filled with clashing spells. Bursts of Halloween magic met waves of spring energy, creating spectacular displays where they collided. Orange and purple sparks rained down alongside cherry blossoms and morning dew, the competing magics refusing to mix properly. Sabrina's students proved their worth, working in pairs and trios to hold back the attackers. Maria and Taylor combined their talents, creating a wall of protective energy that shifted between autumn leaves and thorny branches. Another group channeled their power through crystals, sending pulses of balanced magic that disrupted the spring faction's more aggressive spells. Quill became a blur of motion across the battlefield, its evolved abilities turning the tide of several skirmishes. A portal would open just as an attacker launched a spell, redirecting the magic back at its caster. Another portal allowed defenders to quickly reinforce threatened positions, making their smaller numbers seem much more substantial. At the center of it all, Sabrina maintained her focus on the ritual. Her voice never wavered as she wove the complex enchantment, even when stray spells crashed against the inner barrier mere feet from her position. The artifact pulsed in her hands, responding to both the ritual and the chaos surrounding it. The Spring faction's leader stepped forward, her hands glowing with concentrated magical energy. "Stop this foolishness," she commanded, sending a massive surge of pure spring magic directly at the ritual circle. The power behind it was staggering, enough to completely overwhelm most magical barriers. But instead of fighting against the foreign magic, Sabrina adjusted her incantation. Her voice took on a new rhythm, and the ritual circle began to absorb the spring energy rather than repel it. The artifact glowed brighter, harmonizing the competing magical forces instead of letting them clash. Reality buckled under the magical stress. Trees aged decades in seconds only to rejuvenate just as quickly. Flowers bloomed and wilted in endless cycles. The very air seemed to shimmer with visible magical currents, autumn gold mixing with spring green in impossible patterns. As Sabrina worked to maintain control of these wild energies, understanding dawned in her eyes. She saw how the spring magic and Halloween energy weren't truly opposing forces at all. Like the artifact itself, Hallowville's magic had always been about balance rather than dominance. The town didn't need to choose between eternal spring or endless autumn. Its power came from the natural cycle of seasons, each flowing into the next in an endless dance. Noah caught her eye across the battlefield, and she could see he understood too. He adjusted his tactics, directing their defenders to focus less on blocking the spring magic and more on guiding it into natural patterns. The students followed his lead, their spells shifting from purely defensive to more adaptive forms. Quill chittered excitedly, its quills glowing with both spring and Halloween energy simultaneously. The familiar created a series of small portals around the ritual circle, helping to channel and balance the competing magical forces. Its evolved form seemed perfectly suited to this new understanding of Hallowville's magic. The battle continued to rage, but the nature of the conflict had subtly shifted. Each clash of magic now felt less like destruction and more like transformation, as if the garden itself was teaching them all a lesson about the true nature of magical balance. As the magical energies swirled around her, Sabrina felt a profound shift in her understanding. The competing forces weren't meant to fight, they were meant to dance together, like partners in an eternal waltz. She looked at the artifact in her hands, seeing it not as a tool of control, but as an instrument of harmony. With steady hands, she began to alter the ritual's pattern. Her voice changed pitch, weaving new words into the ancient incantation. The magical circle responded, its rigid lines softening into flowing curves that mimicked the natural cycles of the seasons. Around the garden, the battling mages faltered. Spring magic users lowered their hands, feeling their power shift and blend with the Halloween energies they'd been fighting. Sabrina's defenders also paused, sensing the change in the magical atmosphere. The air itself seemed to soften, carrying the scent of both spring flowers and autumn leaves. Quill darted through its last portal, appearing in the center of the ritual circle. The hedgehog familiar's quills glowed with an intensity that outshone even the artifact. Its small form began to hover slightly above the ground, drawing in streams of conflicting magic like a living lodestone. "Quill," Sabrina whispered, watching as her familiar's form became increasingly luminescent. She could feel their magical bond humming with purpose and understanding. Quill wasn't just absorbing the magic, it was offering itself as a living bridge between the seasons. The realization hit her like a physical blow. Quill's evolved form made it the perfect conduit for balancing Hallowville's magic, but using her familiar this way would require more power than any magical creature could safely channel. The cost would be unimaginable. Tears welled in Sabrina's eyes as she looked at her faithful companion. Quill met her gaze steadily, its eyes filled with determination and love. The familiar had always been more than just a magical pet. It had been her partner, her friend, her family. Now it was offering the ultimate sacrifice to save their home. With trembling hands, Sabrina raised the artifact. "Thank you," she whispered to her familiar, her voice thick with emotion. She began the final phase of the ritual, directing the artifact's power through Quill's glowing form. The hedgehog familiar rose higher, its small body becoming a beacon of pure magical energy. Spring and Halloween magic spiraled around it in tightening circles. Quill's form grew brighter and brighter until it was painful to look at directly, yet Sabrina couldn't turn away. A high, clear note rang through the garden, like crystal singing. Quill's light reached its peak, and for a moment the familiar's form was transformed into pure magical energy. Then the light exploded outward in a silent wave, washing over everyone in the garden and spreading rapidly across Hallowville. When the brilliance faded, the spot where Quill had floated was empty. The ritual circle still glowed softly, but now its light was a perfect blend of spring and Halloween magic. The artifact in Sabrina's hands had grown cool, its work complete. The wave of balanced magic transformed everything it touched. Trees settled into their natural cycles, no longer trapped between seasons. Flowers bloomed normally alongside Halloween decorations that seemed to belong exactly where they were. The very air felt different, still magical but stable and harmonious. Sabrina stood in the center of the ritual circle, tears streaming down her face as she felt the empty space in her heart where Quill's presence had always been. Around her, both Spring faction members and her own allies lowered their weapons, united in witness to the sacrifice that had brought true balance to Hallowville. The magical storm that had engulfed Hallowville dissipated like morning mist, leaving behind an otherworldly calm. The air itself felt different, cleaner, more balanced, as if the town had finally found its true breath after centuries of tension. Sabrina stood in the center of the ritual circle, the now quiet artifact cool in her trembling hands. Around her, both her allies and the Spring faction members lowered their defensive stances, their faces reflecting shared awe at the transformation taking place before them. The hidden garden seemed to pulse with new life. Spring flowers bloomed alongside jack-o'-lantern vines, their contrasting colors creating a stunning tapestry. The trees bore both fresh buds and autumn leaves, yet somehow the combination looked natural, as if this was how they were always meant to be. Noah approached Sabrina carefully, noting the tears streaming down her face, the void where Quill's presence had been felt like a physical wound in her chest. She clutched the artifact closer, her knuckles white with tension. "Quill knew what he was doing," Noah said softly, placing a gentle hand on her shoulder. "He chose to save not just the town, but all of us. That kind of sacrifice comes from love." Sabrina nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. The memory of Quill's final chirp, so full of determination and affection, played in her mind. From the edge of the ritual circle, 3 leaders of the Spring faction stepped forward. Their faces showed a mixture of humility and wonder as they took in the perfectly balanced magical atmosphere. "We were wrong," the eldest among them admitted, her voice carrying across the quiet garden. "We thought dominance would bring prosperity, but this harmony is what Hallowville truly needed." "Then let's ensure it stays this way," Sabrina replied, finding her voice at last. Together. The agreement was sealed with handshakes and quiet nods, the former opponents now united in their desire to maintain the delicate balance they'd witnessed. As they made their way out of the hidden garden, they found Hallowville's streets filled with citizens emerging from their homes. People stood in doorways and on porches, gazing in wonder at their transformed town. The cobblestone streets were lined with an impossible blend of spring blooms and Halloween decorations, each element complementing the other perfectly. A small crowd gathered around Sabrina and Noah, their questions tumbling out in excited whispers. Sabrina stepped forward, ready to explain what had happened. As she spoke about the ritual and the new balance, she noticed her students moving through the crowd, helping to demonstrate the harmonious magic with small, controlled spells. Hallowville has always been magical, she explained, her voice growing stronger. But now we've found a way to embrace all aspects of that magic, to let them work together instead of fighting for control. The townspeople listened intently, their initial confusion giving way to understanding and acceptance. Many of them had lived with Hallowville's magical nature their entire lives, and they could feel that this change was right. Later, as the excitement began to settle, Sabrina found a quiet moment alone on a bench in the town square. She watched as a group of children played nearby, their laughter mixing with the sound of rustling leaves and singing birds. The magic in the air felt stable, peaceful. That's when she felt it, a tiny tug at her magical senses, so faint she might have imagined it. But it was familiar, carrying an essence she would know anywhere. It felt like Quill's playful chirp, like the brush of spiky quills against her hand. The sensation was gone as quickly as it had come, but it left behind a spark of hope in her heart.